Let's begin with breaking news coming out of Bangladesh, where a fire has broken out at a Rohingya refugee camp in Cox Bazar. Emergency services are at the scene. Volunteers are also assisting in efforts to douse the flames. These are pictures coming from the area now. Fires are a regular occurrence at these camps at the border with Myanmar, some of the largest refugee camps in the world. Let's join Tanvir Chowdhury, our correspondent in Bangladesh. He joins me now on the phone from the capital, Dhaka. And Tanvir, let's just talk about these camps. There are several camps in the Cox Bazar area. So which camp has this fire occurred at, and how quickly are your contacts telling you that emergency services were able to try and start working on dousing the flames?
Well, this camp is known as Balukhali camp. There's 32 camps, and Balukhali is one of them. They're nearly about 1.2 million. It's the largest refugee camp in the world. So that's a population of some major cities in the world, living in barely 34 square kilometer area, very densely packed. And so for the latest I know from the camp, when I talked to our contacts, is that the fire is still on. They don't know the reason it started, but it could be one of those cooking cylinder gas they use. Most of the families get one cylinder for cooking, and most cases, those are the culprits. That's where the fire, usually that's due to explosion, or the fire started because most of these huts are made out of bamboos and tarpaulin, and the fire ignites very quickly. And because they're densely packed, the fire spread very quickly. The last incident we know of was on March 2021, and nearly a dozen people died, 50,000 huts got burned, and many others got injured. And that's one of the many incidents that happened.
We're seeing the
cases that...
Sorry, Tanvir, yeah, we're seeing the latest pictures at the moment, Tanvir. We're also seeing the location of the blaze itself. This location is quite hilly, and it would be difficult for emergency services to actually get to the source of the flames. Local people are trying to help in whatever way they can. Just describe the location of these camps and in what terrain people are having to deal with this emergency.
Absolutely. The location is very hilly, you're right. This is in the southeast of Bangladesh, which is a hilly region. It's basically a forest area which has been cleared for the camp. So it's very challenging for fire trucks to get into these hilly tops. So they have to actually manually improvise, take the pipes, or they have some fire equipment within the camp area after those incidents, but there's very little for this kind of fire to, douse them. So what they use is a sand buckets and some improvised water pipes to help the situation, but it's hardly enough to really put this fire under control. It's a very challenging situation, considering most of these huts are in the hilltops, in a sloping hilltop. You can't get the fire trucks there, and there's no, fire pipes or anything in those areas. It's a very rudimentary area. And last we spoke to, the fire is still ongoing. There are at least 7 or 9 fire trucks trying to help douse the fire, and the casualty probably will be quite high, considering the fire is spreading. As I said, it's very densely packed. Majority of the population are women and children. So it's a very dangerous situation for the families, because the kids are running around all around these camps. They don't know about all this fire emergency system. So it's a very vulnerable situation.
Indeed, densely packed areas, lots of people, routes very unclear, both for the emergency services and for the Rohingya refugees that are there. In terms of the emergency health facilities, hospitals, A&E, accident units, what sort of infrastructure does Bangladesh have in that part of the country? Because the one thing that the authorities have always talked about regarding the refugees, they don't get enough help internationally to service the needs of so many in such a small space.
Yeah, very rightly pointed out. It's very basic, the emergency medical facilities. There are a lot of field hospitals, there's MSF hospitals. There's a general hospital which is quite far away, the government general hospital, which is in Cox Bazar town. That's literally 1.5 hour drive from there, which does have emergency high-end facilities. But still, considering 1.2 million people, it's very basic, very rudimentary. There's just not enough facilities to have a first response for fire victim the way you'd expect in a more developed situation. But considering 2017 and how things have improved, there are a lot of field hospitals. Some of them do have emergency room to treat this kind of victims, but just not enough for 1.2 million people. So a very challenging situation in all circumstances. Consider the congestion, the hilltops, location of this area, number of population. It is a very difficult and challenging environment, and just not enough facilities to deal with this kind of emergency fires.
Let's talk about the weather situation at the moment, because obviously fires like this don't erupt unless the conditions are dry on the ground. What season is this for Bangladesh? Obviously parts of the world are dealing with the winter season, but it seems quite dry at the moment. Is this typical for the time of the year? Because obviously the drier the scenario, the worse the situation is for those. And we can see rescue workers with hoses at the moment trying to douse some of the flames. It's incredibly smoky, very dense, and the visibility is quite low. So a difficult time.
Yes, you're right. The weather does make a big difference. This is at end of the dry season. It's still not monsoon. Monsoon won't start till end of April or middle of May when the rainfall will start. So the trees don't have any leaves. It's very dry. There's lots of twigs and dry leaves on the ground. And the weather is very dry. You don't expect any kind of rain in this season because it is end of the winter and it's still a very dry season, making it more vulnerable. And this fire could spread because of this dry weather and as well as dry trees all around it. It used to be barren, but a lot of trees around it. So it could really spread very fast in the camp area. And again, the huts are made out of bamboo, which is highly inflammable, and the top is covered with tarpaulin. It's very basic. There's no concrete or any kind of facilities like this. It's a tent or it's tarpaulin with bamboos, and the bamboos catches fire very quickly.
In terms of the source of the blaze, that will have to be investigated. But it could have been an accident. But we've also heard that over the last few weeks and months, there's been a little bit of intercommunal rivalry within camps themselves. Is that true? And can you perhaps expand on that for us?
Yes, at least the Rohingya community themselves say that many of these fires were actually arson attacks because there are gang violence within the camp, drug rivalry gangs, and there's also intergroup rivalry between different groups and segments within the camp, which has been a major issue in the camp at least last 2 years. Many people died because of this interfeud rivalry. At least some of the camp leaders were shot dead. Even just a couple of weeks ago, at least 2 Rohingyas were shot dead. And this also goes into this incident of fire, because last time in the big fire, most of the Rohingyas pointed it was an arson, which was in March 2021. The investigate couldn't conclude exactly the reason behind the fire, because most Rohingyas think many of these fires have started as a feud between different camps and groups, and usually this arson attacks takes place. But it's difficult to investigate and pinpoint in that kind of circumstance. Considering the environment and the topography, you don't have really that kind of evidence because the fire could have started in any way, because of the cylinders, because of dry woods around it, somebody could lead a fire. But yes, this is a major accusation by the Rohingyas themselves. Even the government authorities acknowledge that this is a very high possibility. Some of these fires are arson attacks.
Just stay with us on the phone for a moment, Tanvir, while we just bring our viewers up to speed. Those of you that are joining us here on Al Jazeera, you're watching live pictures coming from one of the many Rohingya refugee camps in the southeast of the country, near Cox's Bazar. This is most probably the first port of call for many of the Rohingya that have fled the persecution that they've experienced in Myanmar and seek refuge in Bangladesh. The Rohingya are one of the oldest refugee groups in the world, and this is, if not the largest refugee camp in the world. Over 30 smaller camps in a very large area of Cox's Bazar. As you can see, the black smoke billowing from this particular camp. The fire services and emergency services have made it to the scene. It's a very difficult, densely packed area. The shacks, as Tanvir said, are made of local materials, wood, bamboo, palm trees for roofing cover, so easily ignited in what is the end of the dry season and heading into the monsoon season. Tanvir, let's just talk about the size of these camps, because as you say, there's over 30 of them in a very densely packed part of southeastern Bangladesh. When we talk about the smallest of the camps and the largest of the camps, what sort of numbers are we talking about when it comes to those that live in them?
Well, let's say the total population now is at least estimated around 1.2 million Rohingya refugees, making it the largest refugee camp in the world. Now, this Balukhali camp probably holds about 10th of that, which is several 100,000. And it is about barely 34 square kilometer size, So you can imagine that the population of Washington, D.C. and some big cities in Europe or America that's densely packed in a very small area with very rudimentary facilities, making it extremely challenging environment to deal with. And on top of that, as we mentioned earlier, many of these camps are located in the hilltops, which is itself is very challenging to go and douse the fire with fire trucks because you won't be able to reach there. There's a ring road made by the military to encircle the camp. That is the only access point where the fire trucks can go, and then they have to use a long water pipe to go and douse this fire from the fire truck. That's why it's taking so long to bring it under control. And also, there's many other challenging situations in the camp, as you mentioned. I mean, these are very rudimentary facilities made with basic bamboos, and the top is covered with tarpaulin to protect it from the exposure from rain and other materials. So, yeah, very challenging environment, and there's just not enough aid and help coming from overseas. After almost 6 years now, the international community is more or less forgot about the Rohingyas. Recently, there's been cut in funding, which is why the World Food Program said they'll cut the ration for the Rohingyas, which will have a nutritional effect on the children, and half the population is children. So there's a lot of different dimensions to this story, not just the fire. I mean, it's stateless people who are not considered refugees because Bangladesh is not a signatory to the Refugee Convention, making them essentially the largest stateless population in the world. And no hope of any repatriation back to Myanmar because of the political situation there, insurgency even within the Bangladesh border area, making it more difficult and challenging. There's no negotiations right now with Myanmar to take them back, making the whole refugee situation for the Rohingya very challenging. A lot of diplomatic visits, a lot of high-level visits, but nothing tangible really done by the international community. Bangladesh has to bear most of the burden, and they've been very generous so far dealing with the refugees in Bangladesh. And some portion of the refugees have been located to a remote coastal island called Bhasanchar, which is on the coast of Bay of Bengal. It's in the middle of nowhere, an island where 30,000 Rohingyas has already been moved, and the government is planning to move all 1.2 million refugees in this island, which is, again, a very controversial and another challenging move, to say the least.
Well, of course, we'll leave it there for now as you get more information from your sources, and we'll join you later on through the day. But for those of you joining us here on Al Jazeera, these are live pictures coming from southeastern Bangladesh. Some of them are the latest pictures of the blaze that has engulfed the Balukhali camp as part of one of nearly 30 camps in the Cox Bazar area that house and host the Rohingya refugees from Myanmar. As you can see, people in their dozens leaving the local area, thick black smoke covering the whole vicinity. Quite uncertain, I'm sure, for many people which way to go, with no real well signposted emergency routes. The emergency services are finding it very difficult, as you can see, to get to the epicenter of the blaze because the routes into these camps are very narrow, very hilly, and just generally just difficult to get to. Of course, we'll continue to follow this story through the day and get more information to you as we get it.